The desert stretched for miles, dry, golden, and endless. The wind carried whispers of old sins, the kind that never quite fade away. On the edge of that lonely land stood a ranch, once full of laughter, now echoing with silence and greed. That ranch had belonged to the Marsh family for 3 generations. It was more than land, it was pride, legacy, and blood. But things had changed. The fences were falling apart, the barns were half empty, and the man who once rode tall, Elias Marsh, was struggling to hold on. Drought, debt, and betrayal had stripped him of everything, except his will to fight. And that was when Karen Whitlock appeared. She arrived in a carriage of polished oak, dressed in city silks that shimmered beneath the blazing sun. Her face was calm, too calm for a place like this. She smiled as if she owned the world, and maybe in her mind, she did. Karen wasn't a ranch woman, not by birth, not by heart. She was a businesswoman, the kind that never cared who bled for the gold beneath the dirt. She came with an offer. A low one. Too low for a man like Elias, who'd built his life on that soil. But she knew desperation when she saw it, and he was desperate. By the end of the week, the papers were signed. The ranch, every acre of it, belonged to Karen Whitlock. Elias stood silent as her carriage rolled away, dust swirling behind it like a ghost of his father's memory. Karen told herself it was just business. She didn't believe in guilt or ghosts. Not yet. The first weeks at the ranch were quiet. Too quiet. She walked the land with her chin high, inspecting everything, replacing old workers with her own men. The locals didn't like her. They called her the city snake. Some said the land wouldn't take to her, that the soil had memory, that it remembered hands that worked it with love. Karen didn't believe in superstition. But the nights were long, and sometimes, when the wind shifted, she thought she heard voices, the kind that sounded like regret. She had plans, big ones. She wanted to turn the old Marsh Ranch into the largest cattle empire west of the Mississippi. But one thing stood in her way: a cowboy who refused to leave. His name was Luke Hale. He'd been Elias Marsh's right-hand man, tall, quiet, with eyes that had seen too much of the world to trust anyone easily. When Karen took over, Luke didn't say a word. He just kept working, fixing fences, tending cattle, mending roofs, as if the ranch still belonged to the Marsh family. Karen didn't like that. He made her uneasy. His silence felt like judgment. But when she ordered him off the land, he simply said, "This place still needs someone to take care of it." Then he walked away, leaving her staring after him angry, though she couldn't say why. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly something unexpected began to happen. Karen found herself watching him from a distance. The way he worked, steady and patient, as if the land spoke to him. He wasn't like the men she knew in the city, those who smiled with lies on their tongues. Luke said little, but every action of his carried truth. She caught herself wondering what kind of man stays loyal to something that's already lost. Then came the storm. The desert hadn't seen rain in months, but that night, the heavens broke open with fury. Lightning split the sky, wind tore through the valley, and thunder rolled like cannon fire. Karen watched from her porch as the storm ripped across her land. Her land now. And for the first time, she felt something close to fear. Luke appeared out of the darkness, soaked and breathless. He shouted that the lower pens were flooding. The cattle would drown if they didn't act fast. Without hesitation, Karen grabbed her coat and followed him into the storm. Mud swallowed her boots. Rain blinded her eyes. But together, they fought through it, opening gates, driving the herd to higher ground, saving what they could. By dawn, the storm was over. The ranch was battered, but it stood, and Karen, for the first time, understood what it meant to fight for the land, not just own it. She was exhausted, covered in mud, her hair a mess. Yet as she stood beside Luke, watching the sunrise over the wet plains, something inside her shifted. She had come here to take, to conquer. But now, standing in the quiet light of morning, She felt the land whisper something else. Ownership was nothing without love. And love was something she didn't believe in. Not until that moment. But love and greed are enemies. They cannot live side by side for long. Because what Karen didn't know was that Elias Marsh hadn't left the valley. He was still out there, watching, waiting. And he wasn't done with her yet. The morning after the storm brought a strange calm to the valley. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. The kind of smell that clung to memories and refused to leave. The Marsh Ranch, now under Karen Wetlock's name, stood battered but unbroken, its barns half flooded and fences bent by the wind. Yet somehow the land seemed alive again, as if the rain had breathed new life into its weary soul. Karen stood by the porch, watching the sunrise spread gold over the soaked fields. She had spent the entire night working beside Luke Hale, the man who refused to abandon the ranch, even after she had taken it. She told herself she had done it for business, to save the cattle, to protect her investment. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't just that. There was something about the way he moved, quiet but sure, like he belonged to this land in a way she never could. The days that followed felt different. For the first time since her arrival, the workers spoke to her without fear. Luke managed the repairs, while Karen handled the accounts. They worked in silence, yet their presence around each other grew heavier, with every passing hour. But something darker was stirring beneath that calm. Rumors began to drift through town. Whispers that Elias Marsh, the ranch's former owner, had been seen near the canyon, hiding among the rocks like a ghost unwilling to rest. Some said he'd gone mad after losing everything. Others said he was planning to take back what was his, no matter the cost. Karen ignored the talk at first. She believed Elias had left town, broken and bitter. But late at night, when the wind rattled her windows and coyotes howled in the distance, she sometimes thought she saw a shadow watching from the ridge. Tall, silent, unmoving. She told herself it was only her imagination. But the land has a way of remembering those it loves, and those it hates. One evening, while Karen walked the fields to inspect the damage left by the storm, she came across something half buried in the mud. An old horseshoe, rusted but familiar. She turned it over in her hands and froze. The initials, E.M., were etched faintly into the iron. Elias Marsh's mark. The ground beneath her seemed to pulse with an old anger. She dropped the horseshoe and walked back quickly, her heart pounding with a fear she couldn't explain. The next morning, the ranch foreman reported that someone had been tampering with the cattle pens during the night. The gates had been left open, tracks leading off toward the hills. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. Someone wanted to remind her that this land had once belonged to another. Luke didn't speak of it, but his jaw tightened every time her name was mentioned with Marsh's. He worked longer hours, sleeping near the stables, as if guarding the ranch with his own body. Karen noticed, and though she would never admit it, his silent loyalty touched something deep inside her. Still, her pride would not let her say thank you. Not yet. That night, the wind picked up again. The moon hung low, casting silver light across the valley. Karen couldn't sleep. She wandered outside, her robe drawn tight around her, her bare feet cold against the wooden porch. In the distance, she saw a figure standing by the old oak tree, motionless, just beyond the fence. The shape was tall, wearing a hat she recognized. For a long moment, she thought her heart had stopped. It was him. Elias Marsh. He didn't move, didn't speak, but even from that distance, she could feel his gaze. Heavy, filled with something that wasn't hatred, but wasn't forgiveness either. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone, swallowed by the dark. The next morning, the workers found hoof prints leading up to the house and disappearing toward the hills. Luke followed the trail but returned with nothing. Karen tried to keep her composure, but her hands trembled when she held her coffee. The ranch was becoming a prison of her own making, haunted not by ghosts, but by the choices that had led her here. She began to dream of Elias. Dreams that felt more like memories. The sound of his voice arguing with the bank. His face twisted in desperation as she offered the deal that stole his home. She remembered how he'd signed the deed with shaking hands, how she'd smiled when he left, telling herself it was business. But now, those memories burned like fire in her chest. The following week, the unease turned into something worse. A barn caught fire in the middle of the night. Flames roared into the sky, painting the valley in red and gold. The workers ran in panic. Luke shouted orders, trying to save what they could. Karen stood frozen, watching the blaze devour the heart of her ranch. By dawn, half of the barn was gone. And so were several of the cattle. The fire had been no accident. Someone had poured kerosene near the stalls. When Luke handed her the half-burned lantern they'd found near the site, her breath caught in her throat. The initials were carved into the metal. E.M. Again. Karen didn't cry. She couldn't. Her pride had built walls too high for tears. But inside, her heart cracked like dry earth under a hot sun. She had thought stealing the ranch was victory. But now, as she stood in the ruins of what she'd built, she realized something terrible. The land didn't belong to her. Not truly. It belonged to the people who loved it. And she had driven them all away. Even Luke had begun to change. His eyes were colder now, his words fewer, his trust slipping like sand through her fingers. As smoke curled into the morning sky, Karen made a silent vow. She would not run. She would not surrender the ranch, no matter what ghosts haunted it. She would rebuild. She would fight. But in the quiet of her heart, she knew the truth. The real fight wasn't with Elias Marsh. It was with herself, and what she had become. Far off, in the canyon's shadow, a single rider watched her through a pair of worn binoculars. His horse snorted, restless. The man's face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his eyes burned with something cold and patient. Elias Marsh was very much alive. And he wasn't finished. The smell of smoke lingered for days. It clung to the wood, to the soil, to the very air that hung heavy over the marsh valley. What was once Karen's proudest possession now looked like a battlefield. Blackened fences. Charred beams. Ash drifting across the empty sky. The storm had tested her strength, but the fire tested her soul. Karen stood before the ruins of the barn as the morning sun rose behind her. She had built her name on control, on power, on never bending to anyone's will. But for the first time, the land beneath her feet felt like it didn't want her there. The soil itself seemed to whisper, "You don't belong here." Still, she refused to be defeated. The fire might have taken her barn, but it would not take her pride. Luke Hale had been working tirelessly since that night. He repaired fences, salvaged what he could from the ashes, and drove the cattle farther west, where the grass still grew green. Karen watched him from the porch every morning. The sun catching on his shoulders, the rhythm of his movements steady as the heartbeat of the land. There was something in him that stirred the part of her she had buried long ago. A part that wanted more than money or ownership. But she fought it down. Feelings were weakness, and weakness was what ruined people out here. And yet, every time Luke looked at the horizon, she felt the distance between them like a wound. The rumors about Elias Marsh continued to spread. Travelers passing through town spoke of a man haunting the ridge. A ghost on horseback, watching from afar. Karen pretended not to care. But at night, when she stood by her window, she often caught sight of something, glinting under the moonlight near the canyon trail. The fear she'd once felt began to change into something else. Guilt, regret, maybe even longing for redemption. She had stolen this ranch through deceit, but she had come to love it in ways she never expected. Every blade of grass, every breeze through the fence posts. It all reminded her of the man she'd taken it from. It was as if the land itself was teaching her what it truly meant to belong. Weeks passed. Slowly the ranch began to recover. New fences rose, stronger than before. The burned fields sprouted green again after unexpected rains. Karen worked beside her men, not above them, her hands blistered and her face roughened by sun and dust. She earned their respect the hard way, by sweating for it. But not everyone believed her change of heart. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No name, no return address, only 5 words written in rough, uneven handwriting. "You can't steal what lives." She knew instantly who had sent it. Elias Marsh. That night, she sat by the fire, the letter trembling in her hands. The words burned in her mind. The guilt she'd been trying to bury came, rushing back like floodwater. She had taken everything from him. Not just his land, but his purpose, his legacy, his life's meaning. She had thought success would silence her conscience. But the land didn't forgive greed. It reminded her of it every sunrise, every sunset, every time she saw Luke walking across the fields that once belonged to another man. The next morning, she rode out alone. Far beyond the fences, past the grazing cattle, until the ranch lay small behind her. She needed to see it all with her own eyes. What she had built, what she had broken. The wind was dry and sharp as she reached the canyon ridge. Below her stretched miles of dust and rock, wild and unforgiving. And there, standing among the shadows, was a single rider. He didn't move, didn't raise his hand. But even from a distance, Karen knew it was him, Elias Marsh. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The wind fell silent, the air heavy with things unsaid. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she could feel his hatred. Or maybe his sorrow, piercing through the distance between them. When she blinked, he was gone. The canyon was empty again. She turned her horse back toward the ranch, but her heart wouldn't stop pounding. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the weight of what she'd done, the realization that maybe she didn't own this land at all. Maybe it owned her. That night, the ranch felt colder. The air itself seemed to hum with warning. Even the cattle were restless, pacing in the pens as if sensing something coming. Karen tried to sleep, but dreams plagued her. Visions of Elias riding through the fire, his eyes burning like the flames that had devoured her barn. She awoke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the sound of hoofbeats echoing in her mind. But when she looked out the window, the sound was real. Luke was riding hard across the field, his horse kicking up dust. Karen rushed outside just as he dismounted. His face was grim, his shirt streaked with dirt and blood. One of the herds had been attacked, half driven off, half scattered into the hills. Tracks led toward the canyon again. Karen didn't need to ask who it was. The message was clear: Elias Marsh was done watching. He was fighting back. Standing at the edge of her porch, watching the sunrise break over the wounded ranch, Karen finally understood the truth she had been running from. She could rebuild barns, mend fences, and hire men, but she couldn't repair what she had broken inside herself. The fire that burned her barn had not just come from Elias Marsh's anger. It had come from her own greed, her pride, her blindness to the pain she caused. Now, as the land itself bled beneath her feet, that fire began to burn inside her too. Not a fire of destruction, but of reckoning. She knew what she had to do. She would face Elias, not as a thief defending her prize, but as a woman trying to make things right. The wind picked up across the valley, carrying the scent of ash and rain, the kind of wind that foretold change. Karen turned toward the canyon, her eyes hard with resolve. Somewhere out there, Elias Marsh was waiting, and so was her fate. The days that followed the attack on the herd bled together in silence and dust. Karen moved through the ranch like a ghost, her boots tracing the same paths she once walked with pride. Now, every fence post, every hoof print in the dirt felt like a reminder of what she'd taken, and what it was costing her. Luke had tried to hold the ranch together. He rounded up the scattered cattle, patched what could be saved, and guarded the rest through the long, cold nights. But his eyes told a different story. The quiet man who once worked with steady conviction now carried the same haunted look as the land itself. Elias Marsh's shadow hung over everything. His presence was never seen clearly, but it was always felt. Like the weight of a storm waiting beyond the ridge. The workers whispered his name with fear. Some left in the night, unwilling to stay on cursed ground. Others spoke of strange noises near the canyon, of hoof beats echoing without riders, of a figure that disappeared when followed. Karen listened to it all, and for the first time, she didn't try to dismiss it. She felt it too. A growing sense that she was being watched, not just by a man, but by the very spirit of the place she had stolen. The fire in her heart, once fueled by ambition, had turned into something heavier. A desire for redemption. But redemption in the Wild West came with a price, and she was only beginning to understand how steep that price would be. She spent her days riding the outskirts of the property, tracing the borders she now barely felt worthy to claim. The wind had changed. The air felt colder, sharper, filled with secrets that the desert wasn't ready to share. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the red hills, she stopped her horse near the northern ridge, the one that overlooked the canyon below. From there, she could see miles of empty land, painted in gold and blood by the dying light. It was beautiful and cruel. Then she saw it again, a rider on the far side of the canyon, still, silent, watching. Even at that distance, she could sense who it was. Elias Marsh. The man whose land she had taken. The man she had destroyed in her hunger for power. But this time, there was something different about him. He didn't carry a weapon, didn't seem ready for war. He simply sat there on his horse, outlined against the burning sky, a living ghost of everything she had buried. For a long while, neither of them moved. The wind carried dust between them, whispering across the canyon like a voice from the past. Then, slowly, he turned his horse and rode away. The sight left her trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of her own choices. She knew, with a kind of quiet certainty, that this wasn't over. That night, she couldn't sleep. The fire in the hearth flickered low as she stared into it, her reflection dancing in the glow like a stranger. She thought of the letter, the fire, the storms, and the endless guilt that had followed. She had come to this land to win, to rise above the world that had once rejected her. But now, with everything she had gained, she felt emptier than ever before. The ranch had given her everything, and taken her heart in return. As dawn broke, Karen rose and saddled her horse. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't have to. Her eyes said it all. She was riding toward the canyon. The sky was gray that morning, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The earth trembled beneath her horse's hooves as she approached the cliffs. Every step forward felt like a confession. She reached the edge and dismounted, staring down into the winding canyon below. The wind tore at her hair, carrying with it the faint echo of a memory. Elias's voice, calm and wounded, telling her once that a ranch wasn't made of land, but of heart. And she had broken both. Karen walked to the edge, her boots scraping stone. The canyon stretched out before her like an open wound. Somewhere out there, Elias was watching. She could feel it. She raised her eyes to the horizon, and for the first time, she didn't feel anger or pride, only sorrow. She wanted to make things right, not for herself, but for the land, for the man she had wronged, and for the ghost of the woman she used to be before greed had hollowed her out. The rain began to fall, slow, steady, and cold. The sky darkened, and thunder rolled across the valley like a distant drumbeat. Karen turned her horse toward the west, the direction of the canyon trails, and began to ride. As she descended into the shadowed ravine, the storm broke open above her. Lightning split the sky, and the world turned to chaos. Mud splashed under her hooves, the narrow path twisting dangerously close to the edge. But she didn't stop. She rode deeper into the heart of the canyon, chasing the storm, chasing her fate. When the thunder faded and the rain slowed, she found herself in the lower basin. There, among the twisted rocks and jagged cliffs, she saw it again. a single campfire glowing faintly through the mist. She dismounted, her boots sinking into wet sand. The closer she walked, the louder her heartbeat grew. The fire crackled softly, reflected in the wet stones. And beside it, she saw the shape of a man. He was turned away from her, sitting still, his hat shadowing his face. His horse stood nearby, tired and mud-streaked. Everything about him felt familiar. The posture, the stillness, the air of quiet sorrow. Elias Marsh. Karen froze, her breath catching in her chest. For a moment, she wanted to turn back, to flee from the truth that had been chasing her since the day she signed those papers. But she couldn't. The time for running was over. The rain stopped, leaving only the sound of dripping water echoing off the canyon walls. The firelight flickered between them, painting the ground in trembling gold. Karen stepped closer, each footstep heavy with the weight of everything she'd done. She didn't know what she would find here: forgiveness or fury, peace or punishment. But deep down, she knew this meeting was inevitable. The land itself had brought them both here. Above them, the last light of the storm broke through the clouds, casting a thin beam of sunlight into the canyon. It touched the fire, making it burn brighter for just a moment. Two souls stood on the same soil. One who had lost everything, and one who had taken it. And between them lay a silence deeper than any words could ever reach. The canyon held its breath. The rain had stopped, but the storm hadn't left. It lingered in the air, thick, electric, heavy with what was about to unfold. The fire before Karen hissed softly, its smoke curling upward into the gray morning light. Elias Marsh sat by that fire like a man carved from stone. His coat was torn, his hands scarred, his hands half shadowed by the brim of his hat. He looked older now, not by years, but by loss. The kind of age that came when the world takes everything you ever loved. Karen stood just a few steps away, frozen between the urge to flee and the need to face what she had done. The canyon walls loomed around them, like a natural courtroom, the land itself serving as witness to their reckoning. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the rocks. Somewhere above, a hawk cried out, sharp and distant, before disappearing into the clouds. Karen had come here to find closure, to face the man whose life she had taken apart with pen and ink. But as she looked at him now, sitting there in silence, she realized this was never just about land or money. It was about something far deeper, something that bound them both to this cruel, beautiful stretch of earth. She took a slow step forward. The ground beneath her boots was wet and soft, each movement sinking slightly into the mud. She thought of how she had once stood tall, proud, untouchable, and how easily the land had brought her to her knees. Elias Marsh did not look up, but he knew she was there. The weight of her guilt hung thick in the air between them. Karen's heart ached with memories she couldn't undo. The day she signed the papers, the day she smiled as he rode away, defeated. She had told herself it was business, that the ranch would thrive under her control, that she had done what she needed to survive. But now, staring at the man who had lost everything, she understood how hollow her victories had been. The wind picked up again, sweeping through the canyon and scattering ashes from the fire. For a moment, Karen thought the smoke took on shapes. The faces of workers who had left, the laughter of people who once called that ranch home. It wasn't guilt alone that filled her chest. It was something deeper. A strange connection to the man she had wronged. Maybe it was the land that bound them, or maybe it was the fire that had nearly consumed them both. She could feel his sorrow as if it were her own. Above them, the clouds began to part, letting through slivers of pale sunlight that danced across the canyon walls. It was as if the land was waiting for something to break, for the past to finally find peace. Karen's mind drifted back to Luke, to the way he had worked tirelessly to keep the ranch alive, even when the land seemed cursed. He had stayed because he believed in something bigger than ownership. And now, standing here, Karen finally understood what that was. The ranch had never belonged to her, or to Elias. It belonged to everyone who loved it, who lived by its rhythm, who bled for it. It belonged to the earth itself, and no contract could ever own that. Elias finally stood, slowly, deliberately. His movements were wary but certain, like a man who had carried his burden too long and was ready to set it down. The firelight glinted off his boots as he stepped closer to her. Karen felt the canyon tighten around her chest. Not out of fear, but because she knew this was the moment that would decide everything. The man she had destroyed was standing before her, flesh and blood, no longer a shadow or a ghost. And though no words passed between them, she could feel the story written in the silence. Regret, anger, loss, and something else, something unexpected, compassion, because sometimes, the people who suffer most also understand forgiveness best. The wind softened. The fire flickered low, casting their shadows long against the rock. Karen felt her heart begin to break. Not from fear of punishment, but from the release of years of pride and guilt she had carried alone. In that moment, she understood the meaning of loss. Not just his, but her own. She had lost herself long before she ever stole the ranch. And yet, standing there in the canyon, she felt something awaken inside her. Something fragile, like hope. The silence between them stretched on, deeper than words. The land seemed to listen, the rocks echoing the heartbeat of two souls that had finally found each other again. Not as enemies, but as reflections of the same pain. Above them, the sky broke open in gold. The storm was gone. The light spilled down into the canyon, soft and pure, touching their faces like forgiveness. Karen closed her eyes and let it wash over her. For the first time since she'd come to this land, she felt at peace. The earth beneath her felt steady again. The wind no longer whispered curses. It carried calm. The ranch, somewhere far behind them, waited quietly under the morning sun. And though nothing could change what she had done, she knew now that redemption was not about undoing the past. It was about learning to carry it differently. As she turned to leave the canyon, the fire finally burned itself out. A thin column of smoke rose toward the sky, twisting gently before disappearing into the light. Elias Marsh remained behind, a silhouette against the fading glow. He did not follow. He did not stop her. Some things in the West did not need to be said. Karen rode back slowly, her heart heavy but alive. Every hoofbeat echoed with the rhythm of the land. A reminder that she was part of something larger, something she could no longer control, but could finally understand. Behind her, the canyon grew quiet again. The wind swept away her tracks, leaving only the story, one that would be whispered for years in every saloon, every dusty town, every lonely campfire from here to the horizon. A story of greed, guilt, and grace. And though her name had once been cursed, the land would remember something else now. The woman who learned too late that love and loss are carved from the same soil. The morning broke soft over the wide plains. A low mist clung to the earth, curling around the fences, drifting over the fields that once buzzed with the rhythm of men and horses. The sky was pale gold, the color of forgiveness, the kind of dawn that came after a storm to remind the land that life always found a way to begin again. Karen stood on the porch of the ranch house. Her ranch, though it didn't feel like it anymore. The boards creaked under her boots as she looked out across the endless stretch of land. The fences had been repaired, the barns rebuilt, the horses fed and groomed. Life was returning to the place she had once stolen, but not for her sake. For the first time, she had learned to care for it. Not to own it, not to control it, but to tend to it, as one would a wounded soul. The papers that once proved her ownership now lay locked away in a drawer she never opened. The weight of those documents no longer brought her pride. They reminded her of what she had taken, what she had broken, and what she had nearly destroyed. Since the day she left the canyon, something inside her had changed. She had not seen Elias Marsh again, though his presence lingered in every corner of this land. The workers had returned slowly, one by one, as if the earth itself had whispered that the storm had passed. Karen didn't command them. She didn't order or bargain. She worked beside them, her hands blistered, her back sore, her eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. It was her quiet way of asking forgiveness, and though no one spoke of it aloud, the ranch began to breathe again. The cattle grazed freely. The windmill turned steady. The sound of hammers and laughter filled the air. Life had returned, though something in the air still carried a kind of sacred melancholy, a memory that would never quite fade. As Karen watched the sun climb higher, she felt a strange peace in her chest, fragile but real. It had been months since that day in the canyon, months since she had faced Elias and seen in his eyes not hatred, but something she could never forget. That look, a mixture of pain and mercy, had followed her in her dreams ever since. It had stripped her bare, made her question every choice she had made. She had once thought love was something you could possess, just like land, just like wealth. But love, she learned, was something you earned, something that couldn't be signed or sealed, only given and received. And sometimes, when it came too late, it left a scar deeper than any bullet. The wind rose, tugging gently at her hair. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of sage and soil, the scent of a new day. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped in this land. She felt part of it. Down by the corral, a young ranch hand waved at her. A new worker, barely 20, full of the same hope and stubbornness she once had. She lifted her hand in return, a faint smile crossing her lips. There was life beyond guilt. There was always a way to begin again. But the past didn't vanish easily. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Karen took a ride out toward the far edge of the property, the boundary where the fence met the canyon trail. It was a quiet place, the kind where time felt slower, where the land seemed to breathe. She dismounted and walked the last few steps to the overlook. The canyon stretched wide and empty, painted in gold and shadow, the same place where her pride had broken. She knelt and placed a small wooden cross in the soil. No name, no dates, just a mark, a silent tribute. It wasn't for a grave. It was for everything she had lost. Her greed, her ambition, her blindness. She buried them there in the dust where they belonged. As she stood, she noticed something faint in the distance. A lone rider, small against the dying light. The figure moved slowly, steadily, the dust trailing behind the horse like smoke. Her heart tightened. Even from far away, she knew who it was. Elias Marsh. He didn't ride toward her. He didn't turn his head. He was heading west, into the setting sun. The direction of freedom, of endings. His silhouette looked smaller with each passing second, until he was just a blur swallowed by the horizon. Karen didn't call out. She didn't move. Some goodbyes didn't need words. She stood there until the sun slipped away, until the stars began to rise over the canyon rim. The sky turned deep violet, and the air grew cool. The land was quiet, peaceful, the kind of silence that came only when something had finally settled. When she returned to the ranch that night, she didn't light the lanterns. She sat by the window, watching the stars reflect on the water trove outside. The moon hung full and pale, and in its light, the fields looked silver, untouched, eternal. For the first time, Karen didn't feel haunted. The land had accepted her again, not as an owner, not as a conqueror, but as a keeper of its story. The West had a way of humbling even the proudest hearts. It gave nothing freely, but it always gave lessons. Harsh, unforgiving, but true. Karen had taken everything she could once hold, the deeds, the fences, the house, the control. Yet in the end, she lost the only thing that truly mattered, her heart. And through that loss, she found what no ownership could ever bring: redemption. As dawn crept once more over the hills, painting the world in gold, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. Not to own, not to win, but to live in truth with the land and whatever future it would allow her. The ranch would thrive again. Not because of her power, but because she finally understood her place within it. And though the story of Karen and Elias Marsh would fade into whispers and rumor, told around saloon fires and under starry skies, the land would remember. It would remember the woman who came to steal, but stayed to heal. The woman who stole the ranch, but lost her heart.